Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's raining slightly, and so we'd like to thank you for coming despite the inclement weather and having taken time out of your busy schedules. And there are those who are participating online. We'd like to thank them as well. As it is time, we'd like to start. I'll be serving as facilitator and coordinator. My name is Kyoichi Sasazawa, Senior Research Fellow, Yomiuri Institute, coordinator of the forum. Yomiuri Shimun and YIES every year fixes a theme for the year, and several times during the year we conduct a fora in alignment with the annual theme. The annual theme is Annual Era of Distrust and Confrontation Tests Japan's Responsiveness. Under this theme, we have today a forum on how to overcome the energy crisis. IEA's chief energy economist, Tim Gould, is the speaker. And we have eminent persons from Japan who will be participating in a panel discussion looking at the recent situation. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is prolonged, and there's a crisis on the Middle East. And with regard to energy supply, the international situation is becoming increasingly nebulous. It's 50 years since the establishment of YIES, and at this timing, we have a talk of India joining and looking at the seventh energy basic plan is being formulated in Japan. And so from this perspective, we would like to have an analysis of the present status, challenges, and role of Japan. And at this forum, YIES and Yomiuri Shimun, MRI, these three entities are co-sponsoring the event. So we thank you for your cooperation in advance. To your left, you'll find receivers. The receiver channel is such that Japanese is on channel 1 and English is on channel 2. And as for your receivers, please do not take them home, and give it to one of our staff on your way out of this hall. So we'd like to have a keynote speech from Mr. Tim Gould for 20 minutes to briefly introduce Mr. Tim Gould. He has graduated from Oxford University in the UK, and he has also attended School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins Universities, and based on Brussels, Europe and Eurasia energy situations is what he's involved in. And in Eastern Europe, he has been involved in research. And 2008, he joined IEA, and Russia and the Caspian Sea area is where he did energy research on. And 2008, he became chief economist of IEA. And the annual publication of IEA, the World Energy Outlook, is something which he was involved as editor, and he is in the position of a joint responsible person. So we'd like to hear from Mr. Gould. Could we have a round of applause, big round of applause for the speaker, please?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's a huge pleasure to join you from the IEA headquarters in Paris, and many, many thanks for that kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to join this Yomiuri International Forum to talk about an extremely important topic, how to overcome the energy crisis. But before we look forward, I would like to just look backwards and consider a little bit where we have come from in the international energy sector. And the first way to do that would be to look back at how far we have traveled since the creation of the International Energy Agency after the first oil shock in 1973. And the first thing you notice is that there have been some quite substantial changes in the energy mix over the last 50 years with that shift away from oil. But the second thing you'll notice is that if you look in terms of the absolute volumes, the energy system is significantly larger today. And in fact, all aspects of the energy supply have grown over the last 50 years. A similar situation when you look only at oil demand, a big shift in the composition of demand away from the advanced economies towards emerging market and developing economies. But again, when you look at the absolute volumes, all parts of the system are larger now than they were 50 years ago. And just one data point that may be interesting, in 1973, there were something like 50 million passenger cars on the road around the world. Now, there are more like 1.3 billion. So an increase of some 26 times. And yet oil demand has, in a sense, only doubled over that period. And I think that speaks to the shifts in the composition of demand over this period and the concentration of oil demand in the transport sector. But it also highlights the abiding importance of energy efficiency in maintaining balance and supporting energy security objectives. And energy efficiency in this sense means fuel efficiency for cars, but also more recently, the shift towards a more electrified transport system. And finally, a theme of this presentation will also be the shift towards a more electrified energy world. You can see that here, the composition of electricity generation and the way that we have almost pushed oil out of power generation. But there's now 6 times more electricity being used around the world than there was in 1973. And we've seen a very large expansion, particularly in recent years, in the contribution of renewable energy. And that shift towards a more electrified, renewable-rich system is, I think, an important theme of this presentation today. We are talking about the energy crisis. Here are some indicators of that crisis, the very sharp spikes that we saw, particularly for gas prices in the European Union after the cutoff in Russian pipeline supply. And this was, of course, felt not just in Europe, but around the world by consumers, transmitted by international markets and the increasingly liquid market for LNG. But there were some other very important implications as well. A rise in household energy bills of around 20% compared with the average for the previous 5 years. Of course, the impacts on inflation, and we're still feeling those impacts on borrowing costs. And that has important implications also now for investment, particularly in more capital-intensive technologies. And it is true that many of the clean energy technologies that many are trying to bring into the system more quickly are characterized by high capital intensity. So higher borrowing costs makes life more difficult for project developers of clean energy. And then the final aspect of this on the right-hand side shows how we had seen some positive trends for gaining access to electricity amongst the many hundreds of millions that lack access to electricity today. But that was also reversed first by the effects of the COVID pandemic and then by the energy crisis itself. And the effects were particularly felt in sub-Saharan Africa. So when we think about ways out of the crisis, one of the ways that governments have looked to move away from the effects of this extreme spikes in fossil fuel prices was to step up deployment of some key clean energy technologies. And you see the patterns on the screen here for solar PV, for wind, electric cars as well, and notably now for battery storage as well. We've seen very sharp increases in deployment over the last few years, dominated by developments in advanced economies and in China. And you can see that also in the investment numbers. We have, since the crisis, seen a very sharp pickup in global investment in clean energy, whereas investment in oil, gas, and coal supply suffered in 2020 during the COVID pandemic and has only just got back to the levels that it was in 2019. And even if we isolate two of the most well-known aspects of that clean energy picture, so just investments in renewables and in electricity networks, there is now more money going each year into investment in those two aspects of the energy system than there is in all parts of the fossil fuel system. So I think when you look at these kinds of numbers, you can see that the global energy crisis has also prompted quite a sharp shift in the allocation of capital to the energy sector, an increase, and all of that increase coming from clean energy investments. Now, this comes with a couple of caveats, and I think the most important one is that there is a high degree of concentration in those clean energy investments. So around 85% of that global spending comes from advanced economies and China together. And that is a worrying indicator from the perspective of the International Energy Agency, because it means that 2/3 of the world's population are living in emerging and developing economies outside China. Those are the countries that will see the largest increase in demand for energy services. But at the moment, they account for only 15% of global energy investment. But nonetheless, we are seeing some important structural changes in the way that energy is produced and consumed around the world. And that starts to have some interesting implications then for the outlook for fossil fuels. And I'd like to look at this particularly through the prism of developments in China, because China is obviously a very important part of the global energy system and has been a driver for many of the developments that we've seen in fossil fuel markets. Over the last 10 years, almost 2/3 of global oil demand growth has come from China. Something like 1/3 of gas demand growth. Pretty much everything that happens in coal markets is China related. But China, in our view, is changing. Economic growth is not only slowing, but it is changing in qualitative terms. We are reaching the end of this period of very heavy, energy-intensive, infrastructure-led growth. And in our view, that has implications also for China's demand for fossil fuels, given that China is investing very heavily in a range of clean energy technologies, not just renewables, but also nuclear, and has some quite impressive energy efficiency policies as well. And the sorts of changes that we see for China in fossil fuel demand start to have implications also then for the global trends. And this is our outlook under today's policy settings. And you see that these structural changes that have been accelerated by the global energy crisis move us into a world where we no longer have growth in fossil fuel demand, not for coal, not for oil, and not for natural gas as well. Of course, there are different sensitivities around this kind of analysis, and I'd be happy to talk more about those in the question and answer session. But I would like to talk a little bit more about the perspectives for oil and gas. And I'd like to look first at the investment picture. So this is, as I was describing earlier, we've now got back to the situation that we had in terms of investment flows into oil and gas that we had prior to the pandemic, but we haven't arrived exactly back into the same place. And I would like to explain why. We have shifted a bit from investment in oil towards investment in gas as companies look to replace those missing Russian volumes. We've also seen a shift in the patterns of spending away from the majors and away from Russia towards NOCs in the Middle East and in Asia. And that's what you're looking at on the right-hand side of the screen, some of these shifts in the composition of spending. And one other observation is that for the moment, spending outside their core businesses, so outside of oil and natural gas by the oil and gas industry, remains quite small, at less than 4% of total capital spending. But we do have, you may have seen recently, we released our new oil market forecast to 2030. And it showed a little bit the picture that I've just been describing. We still have continued growth in oil demand in the near term, around 1 million barrels a day of growth this year. But that growth slows over time, so that by the end of this decade, we reach a plateau at around 106 million barrels a day in oil demand. However, the world's capacity to produce oil is significantly larger than 106 million barrels a day. In our view, by the end of this decade, thanks to investments being made, or growth in production also in Guyana, in Brazil, in the United States, in Canada, and a few other countries in the world, and investments elsewhere, we will be in a position where we could produce something like 114 million barrels a day of oil. So we would have almost 8 million barrels a day of spare capacity. And that is a very unusual situation in global energy markets. And it implies a difficult environment for some aspects of OPEC plus strategy. It also could imply downward pressure on prices. And there is a somewhat similar dynamic also in global gas markets, because there is a very strong wave of new LNG liquefaction capacity coming to market. At the moment, these are projects for which decisions have now been taken and which will start to come into operation, particularly from around 2026. And in our view also, that will change the conversation about natural gas from one which has been dominated by worries about security of supply and price spikes over the last few years, to one where we will be dealing with a much more ample supply side picture and also potentially downward pressure on prices. I'd like to say a few words also on clean energy supply chains and critical minerals. And the first observation is that we do have a high degree of concentration in the manufacturing of many of the key clean energy technologies. I'm sure this picture is familiar to you. But I think the interesting point here is that despite the efforts of governments around the world, in advanced economies and elsewhere, to push develop more clean energy manufacturing at home, the picture of high concentration and high reliance on China does not change very rapidly. We recently released some analysis on clean energy manufacturing, showing that in 2022, 85% of the world's investment in new clean energy manufacturing facilities was in China. In 2023, that went down, but it only went down to 75%. And I think that sort of picture is confirmed by the concentrations that you're looking at on the screen. So there's a great deal of attention being paid to how we can make our clean energy supply chains more resilient. And we also, at the International Energy Agency, pay a great deal of attention to the markets for key critical minerals. And a big feature of those markets as well has been some price declines, similar in some senses to the price declines that we've seen for fossil fuels in 2023. So by and large, for critical minerals, we are back around the levels seen pre-pandemic. Copper is a bit of an exception there, but lithium spot prices have fallen by some 75% over the last 18 months. Cobalt, nickel, graphite prices also have dropped as well. And it's interesting to look at the reasons. It's not because demand has slowed. It's really because supply from a number of areas, from Africa, from Indonesia, from China, has come through quite strongly. And there are quite high inventories of battery cells and cathodes in many countries as well. And what are the implications of those price drops? It's a bit of a double-edged sword. It has helped to bring down the cost of clean energy technologies and the affordability of transitions. That's been a big topic for us at the International Energy Agency. But it's also been a disincentive for some of the new projects to come through. Investment in critical minerals production continues to increase, particularly for lithium. But when we looked at the projects that were experiencing difficulties because of lower prices, we found that most of the projects that were at risk were the ones that were coming through from a more diversified group of countries. So in a sense, our goal to diversify production may be put at risk by this new price environment. When we look out a bit further into the future and look at the mineral requirements for clean energy transitions, the picture you're looking at on the screen is the demand that we would expect to see in a world in which countries are achieving their national climate goals, whether those are NDCs or long-term net zero targets. And these are the total demand, and you need to subtract from that the amount that we think could be met by recycling and reuse. And then we went through and looked at all of the supply projects that are out there for these different minerals and metals, and to see the adequacy of supply projects in a base case which just looks at approved projects and existing projects, and then a high production case which looks at projects that are also at advanced stages of development. And the situation is, broadly speaking, we can divide the world into a couple of camps. There are a couple of key minerals, copper and lithium, where we do see a shortfall of supply relative to the amounts that we would need in such a scenario. There are others where supply-demand balances look more adequate, but I have to say that those are also the ones where we have the greatest concerns about supply concentration. And finally, before closing, I wanted to say a few words about nuclear, because nuclear for us is a very important part of the answer to the energy crisis. And indeed, I spoke a little bit earlier about the investment picture. And in 2020, our anticipation for 2024 is that we are going to see quite a strong uptick in investment in nuclear, both for lifetime extensions in some cases, but also for some new builds. And I think, broadly speaking, this picture, I hope, is familiar to you, but nuclear remains a very important part of low emissions electricity generation. It makes up just over 9% of global electricity generation, with over 30 countries operating nuclear reactors. And it is, as you see on the screen, still the second largest source of low emissions electricity after hydropower, 1/4 more than wind and double the amount of solar PV globally. And we think that, particularly in light of the global energy crisis, there is a strong reinforcement of the case for nuclear power for both energy security and climate reasons. Of course, we recognize that the reception for nuclear power varies widely by country. So it's for those countries that where it is socially and politically possible to produce it, we see the case for moving ahead with those projects. And it's also true that nuclear plays a very important part of our pathway to net zero emissions that we have modeled extensively here at the IEA. You can see the importance there in terms of installed capacity, and indeed for annual capacity additions in that pathway to net zero, a world in which we keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. So emerging and developing economies, they would account for most of the global growth, with China set to become a leading nuclear power producer before 2030. But there's also important increases in advanced economies, mainly in the United States, France, UK, Canada, but also some projects in Japan. Very clearly, there is a lot that the nuclear power industry would have to do to bring us towards this picture, and a key part of that is delivering projects on time, on budget. And this means, in our view, competing nuclear projects in advanced economies at a capacity cost of around $5,000 per kilowatt by 2030. And that's 40% below the reported costs of recent first-of-a-kind projects. We also have a lot of analysis going on here about the potential for small modular reactors to contribute also to energy security and climate goals. They are a promising emerging technology, and there is some quite significant momentum building behind SMRs with a burst of recent activity. So as of January this year, there were 3 SMRs in operation, 3 under construction, and more than 70 under development. And we believe that if the costs look favorable, once we have a more detailed picture of that cost, of those cost evolutions in a few years' time, then these kinds of reactors could be a good match for the sort of electricity system that we have in the future, where there is more of a premium on flexibility, and there is, in a sense, a potential for SMRs to provide very important services, both for power generation, but also potentially in other areas, potentially providing heat and hydrogen. So I think I would leave it there. I have spoken for for slightly more than my allotted time, so apologies for that. But I hope this has given us some food for thought, and I look forward very much to hearing your reactions and the thoughts of a very distinguished panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I was engrossed, especially the latter part on critical minerals, SMR. These were refreshing topics and entry points of the discussion. So we're pressed for time, and I'm sure the audience have a lot of questions. So let us make some preparations. As soon as the panelists seem to be seated now, so let me introduce them. To your left, we have Professor Koichiro Tanaka, Professor, Graduate School of Media and Governance. Middle East and international relations, energy security are subjects of his expertise. He has studied Persian in Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, and he was a senior analyst at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he was also UN SMA, UN Special Mission to Afghanistan, and he was also Director for the Middle East Studies Center. And next we have Professor Yukari, Professor Institute for Future Initiatives of University of Tokyo. He's graduated from Kyoto University and Hitotsubashi University and Nagoya University. And presently, she is chair of the Strategic Policy Committee of Advisory Committee for Natural Resources and Energy, and member of the Strategic Policy Committee and Advisory Committee for Natural Resources and Energy, and member of the Advisory Group on Climate Change and Sustainable Development of the Asian Development Bank. And then we have Dr. Ryusuke Shida, Chief Researcher at Mitsubishi Corporation. He has joined MRI after having graduated from University of Tokyo, energy policy support, and he consults with private sectors, and he has also assisted in terms of UN renewable energy development, and in 2020 he became MRI's research recommendation team's energy development company research and policy recommendations. He has been involved in putting this together. Mr. Gould's presentation was very interesting. So we'd like to have the 3 panelists state comments and make initial remarks. So could we turn to Professor Tanaka, please?
Thank you very much, Mr. Gould. It was very interesting. I heard with great interest. What you said is, of course, everything I agree with you, and I am fully convinced from what you said. So at this point in time, there was nothing that I could ask, but I would like to point out some disturbing points. This is not a question, but I want to make a comment. Disturbing factor. Geopolitics, international situation. In view of the geopolitics, in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, which continues even today. And in 23, from October, Middle East, Palestine became the hot spot. And the conflict still continues. That is the situation. So relatively speaking, Europe, close to Europe, in regions, things are very noisy. Regions are close to Europe. The Russian supply of gas to Ukraine or the petrochemical products are boycotted and so forth. A lot of impacts were felt because of this geopolitical situation. For Middle East, it was a it was a tailwind, first time in long years. And around 2015, when Paris Accord was agreed, the tailwind was blowing. But if you looking into the future, the gas and oil are the very important treasures. But now they are, the concern is that it may become a stranded asset. There is no place to sell. So in place of Russia, the Middle East has become the focal point once again. So I wouldn't say revival, but the confidence is restored in Middle East. But in Middle East, once again, it's not an energy-related country, but Israel and Palestine. Between Israel and Palestine, there is a conflict. We are in the nascent period of conflict, but the Tamal oil field has stopped its operation, and as a result of that, LNG provision from LNG plant in Egypt has stopped, so it is a knock-on effect. So considering that there are two conflicts ongoing, two conflicts. If you think of 1973 or 1979, the first or second oil crisis, oil shocks, the impact is not as serious as that. But considering the supply as well as the supply destinations, maybe the situation is providing a new opportunity for us to consider. I'm talking about fossil fuel, but in the world is going into a decarbonized world, or carbon neutrality, then in different fields, assertions may be made in a different way. So going forward, as I described, not limited to fossil fuel, regarding critical minerals supply, as well as other issues, the current Middle East and the Ukrainian situation and conflict, in what way would it impact the supply chain? In what way would it impact the infrastructure or production plans? And not even these two conflicts, but the next conflict may be happening in Africa, which is important in critical minerals. Something new could happen. That is the concern that I have. So US or France are receding from some countries of Africa, and Russia is replacing. So backfilling is done by Russia in some countries of Africa. If this structure continues, then regarding renewable energies, carbon neutrality efforts, IEA, and Mr. Gould, yourself, what is your take on this recent situation?
Thank you very much. Could we move to Professor Takamura, please? Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me today, MRI, Yomiuri Shimun, and YIES. I'd like to thank the three organizing entities. Energy policy discussions are such that I've been involved for 15 years. And then there are here Mr. Komiyama of MRI and IEA's Secretary General Mr. Tanaka here. So it's really sobering. It's uncomfortable for me to be speaking in front of these experts. So we listened to Mr. Gould, and a major energy crisis. Bearing this in mind, the energy landscape was presented by Mr. Gould. What was most impressive, I thought, was that electrification and renewable energy, nuclear and decarbonized power sources in the power mix and in terms of primary energy, there's an increase in percentage of these. And I think IEA has said this, historically speaking, in the past 50 years, and also in the past 50 years, structural changes have taken place, and that is the evaluation being made. So decarbonization declaration has been issued to the effect that fossil fuels would be reduced, and a non-transitional structural change is happening. With regard to renewable energy, based on the IEA analysis recently, last year in December, November and December saw the convening of COP28 and the large decarbonization targets to be achieved, and in relation to the 1.5 degrees by 2030, to increase threefold the capacity of renewable energy. And so renewable energy in particular, what was mentioned, solar and wind cost reduction has very much advanced, and it almost offsets the energy demand of the world. That is the extent that we're seeing of the increase. But still, the introduction of speed is still insufficient. So IEA has put forth a target of renewable energy being increased 3 times. And what was impressive, again, is that among the fossil fuels, depending on the type of fossil fuel, there are differences. Coal is reducing with regard to gas and oil. If you look at the present policy basis, a certain amount would be maintained. That is the trend, and that is another impressive point, which was put forth by Mr. Gould. And lastly, with regard to energy crisis impact, fossil fuel prices going up is something we've experienced, and supply anxiety is something that we have experienced. But if we look at other decarbonized power source, it increases in competitiveness. So decarbonized fuel would increase in terms of competitiveness. But the energy price going up would impact houses and companies, and offshore wind. With regard to these large projects, equipment prices and rise in equipment prices would curb growth within the renewable energy category. And I think that could be understood from the presentation. I have 2 questions. One is the following. In Japan, at present, a new basic energy strategy has been formulated, and in it, it is mentioned that it talks about the future energy trend, demand trend. How do you see that? With regard to the steps demand trend, I have seen it, especially with regard to fossil fuels. But with informatization, AI, and new technology being introduced, and data centers are expanding in size and scale. So energy demand, I think, would be increased as a result of this. There are some discussion to this effect. But on the other hand, the energy conservation technology is being used widely. That is also being pointed at. So from a global standpoint, the future energy demand trend, how do you see this, Mr. Gould? This is what I'd like to ask about. The other point is related to Mr. Tanaka's question. Maybe I will ask it in a different way. From the standpoint of a cost, renewable energy cost will go down, and fossil fuels prices relatively towards net zero policies will be enhanced, and it is to be improved, increased. And so toward the net zero, the nuclear capacity is expected to be increased. And so with regard to future energy mix in the future of the world, especially toward net zero, for each power source and with regard to each energy source, so what will be the breakdown and how much will each account for? That is my question. Thank you. Thank you very much. We'd like to ask Mr. Gould the questions later on, dividing into two sections. Move on to Dr. Shida. Shida is my name. Thank you very much for a very outstanding, inviting me to this very outstanding panel session. And I'm also very nervous, as was Professor Takamura. As has been mentioned earlier, I work for a think tank and I'm a consultant. And so I talk with different people. And so I'd like to quote from some of those who I have met in giving my intervention in Mr. Gould's presentation. Before I ask the question, in forecasting the future energy market, I'd like to state what I think might be important. First, as was seen in the presentation, under the present circumstances, there's a lot of tension, international tension. There's a lot of division, and so decarbonization has to take place within this divided environment. That's a unique situation. During the days of the Kyoto Protocol, I talked to Ministry of Environment official who was involved in this, and climate change countermeasures have advanced, and that was due to the Rio summit. Almost all of the UN countries were present, and there was broadly an international consensus. And then there was a period of peace after this, and I think that was a major point. With the globalism and the climate change, the countermeasures proceeded together. And recently in 2020, beginning with Europe, there has been a net zero declaration, and IEA 2021 came out with a zero report. Backdrop to this is the U.S. presidential election results. And so the major industrialized countries were aligned as a result of this. And so what I wanted to say was that climate change countermeasures largely progressed because countries coordinated. Presently, there's a lot of international division, but we have to go ahead with decarbonization. So we're in a phase that we've never experienced before, and I think this is a very important point. And the second point is the gap between reality and ideals. Maybe I should not refer to this, but what would fill this gap would be industrial policies among different countries, and this is on the increase. I'd like to take note of that. The major countries, net zero, carbon neutral declarations have been made in Europe in 2040. Even in the interim years between elections, they have put forth very ambitious goals. And then I talked about the international society and the division. Energy security is becoming very important, and as Professor Takara has mentioned, prices are going up. biomass or renewable projects are being suspended because of the rise in prices. What in terms of policy they wish to aim, and the realities in market, that there's a gap between the two. To fill the gap, the respective countries are taking industrial policies, climate change countermeasures, and domestic industries. They think of this in an integral fashion to provide support. Industrial policies are such that it was a method used originally in the emerging countries, but recently IMF and advanced industrial countries are employing this method. And so in a different way from the past, advanced industrial countries are embracing industrial policy in a way that they have not done so in the past. The negative aspects we have to be very careful of. So we have to look at how countries are doing in terms of balancing climate change countermeasures and industrial policies. And I believe this is very important in thinking about industrial policy at the moment. I'm sorry, my introduction has been very long. And I have questions to Mr. Gould. 2 points I'd like to raise. The first point, Mr. Sasazawa talked about India joining IEA. The global south countries, they're enhancing their presence. And the non-OECD countries' energy policies, they will have a larger impact overall. So the global south and developments there, are there anything that you are noting among developments in the global south? And the second point is with regard to nuclear. It's important from the standpoint of energy security, and I agree with that. On the other hand, Indonesia or Bangladesh, who will be introducing nuclear going forward, and there are many such countries on the increase, and we have to think about nuclear security from that standpoint. So expansion of nuclear and the positives and negatives in terms of energy security in the face of increasing nuclear among new countries. Thank you very much. Several questions were raised, so I'd like to put them to Mr. Gould. And one is the Middle East and the fossil fuel prices. And on the other hand, there's the net zero goal and objective. So the future energy mix and the ratio and projections, if you could talk about that, the future energy mix, please.
Well, thank you very much indeed to this extremely distinguished panel. There were some wonderful observations there, and I'd like to pick up on a few of the points made. I think a number of the observations were around the intersection of geopolitics and the energy system, and I think it's a very interesting line of inquiry to think through how do energy transitions look, and how do they look different in a world where we have strong sort of geopolitical rivalries. And indeed, you could make the case that industrial policy, which is also a function of geopolitical rivalry in some ways, is helping to accelerate the pace of change. It is very striking from our standpoint that when we look at the drivers for that pickup in clean energy deployment, this is not just about emissions reductions. This is about economic and technology drivers, but it's also about the push to make sure that transitions are politically viable in today's very competitive international context. And that means ensuring that there is local value, that there is that countries manage to get a foothold in clean energy value chains and the jobs that come with them. But exactly as Dr. Shida pointed out, there is a risk there too. If we go into a world where we have major new obstacles to the flow of goods and services and ideas, clean energy transitions also become more difficult, more expensive. And so getting that balance right is extremely difficult. But I think this is where we are with sort of that intersection of geopolitics and energy transitions. And I think we've seen with the global energy crisis how geopolitics affects energy markets But I think we also have to have in mind that changes in energy markets as we move through transitions will also have very significant implications for geopolitics as well, particularly as we get shifts in the revenue associated with fossil fuel export. Because if indeed we move to a more accelerated pace of energy transitions, then that is likely to have quite significant implications for those countries that are highly dependent on hydrocarbon revenues. And it will increase the pressure, of course, on those countries to diversify, but at the same time, it will reduce the revenue that can be used to support that process of diversification. And that will come with, of course, some geopolitical risks. And our view in the International Energy Agency, I think, is very well aligned here with the instincts of Japan. We are in favor of finding models for collaboration with today's producers that give them also some incentives to move into new value chains. And I think the way that Japan has discussed with many producers in the Middle East and elsewhere about moving towards the export of low emissions fuels, I think is an incredibly important aspect, not just of the transitions themselves, but also the geopolitics of those changes. There was a question also about new sources of energy demand, and in particular, a very hot topic in the energy world at the moment, the intersection between AI and the energy sector. Now, there are very different views out there on how large the implications will be for electricity demand. And we are looking in detail and talking a lot with the major players, with Google, with Microsoft, with others, to try and understand the implications of these changes. There will be some implications, but there is no consensus at the moment about how large they will be. And the more I investigate this topic, the more it becomes slightly more complicated, because I think it also depends on the way that we use data in the future. You know, how much of our data needs are met by data centers, how much will be on our devices that we have at home. These are open questions, and they will also have implications for the way that electricity demand responds, and also the infrastructure needs for this new services that we demand. There are parts of the world that are already seeing strains from this. Ireland is a good example, where above 15% of Irish electricity consumption is now from data centers. It's a very important source of demand in many cases. But let's not forget that when we think about AI and energy, it's not just a question about the implications for electricity demand. We could also see some very strong implications for the way that we manage energy transitions. There are examples already of how AI accelerates the pace at which new technology innovations are made, and potentially how quickly they come to market. There are examples already about how AI helps us with the balancing of supply and demand in an increasingly renewable rich power system, by increasing our ability to think through those very complex changes that will be needed to maintain electricity security at all times. Of course, that creates some new risks, but there is also an important opportunity there for us to harness the power of these new technologies for the process of change. And then there was a question also about different costs and the way that plays into the future electricity generation mix. And here I think we need to be a little bit careful with the metrics that we use, because the typical measure of the cost of different sources of electricity generation is a metric that is called the LCOE, the levelized cost of electricity. And that looks at the cost of producing from different technologies over the lifetime of a project. We do not believe that this is the right metric to consider all aspects of the future of our electricity system, because particularly in the case of wind and solar, these are cheap, but they also, the more that you add, the less value that next increment of generation brings to the system, because they are all tending to produce at the same time. And so you need to look not just at the cost of production, but also the qualitative aspect of that generation and the way that it affects system operation. So that is a long way to say that we need a mix of technologies in order to have a balanced system at all times of day, but at all times of the year, particularly in systems that have large variations in seasonal demand. So we will have, in our view, a very significant role for variable sources of generation, of clean generation, like wind and solar. But there is an absolutely essential role to be played also by other technologies, particularly things like hydropower, potentially bioenergy, potentially low emissions gases, and natural gas for an extended period to maintain electricity security. And we also believe that there is a role in here for countries there where it is acceptable for nuclear to play an important part in that system. So I'm not going to put figures on all of this because it really varies from country to country. But I think the variety is the key. I mean, diversity is always the big important factor when it comes to energy security, and we should not lose sight of that in a new system. And just a word on that, because at the moment we do have a high degree of concentration in the choices of technology for new electricity generation. So in our investment work, we found that the money going into new solar PV projects today is now greater than the amount going into all of the other technologies combined. So the amount going into solar is around $500 billion each year. And if you add up oil, gas, wind, nuclear, everything else, it's less than that. And that is a symbol of how attractive the economics of solar are. But I think there is a hint of a warning there as well, that we should not be relying too heavily on a single technology for our future electricity security either. Sorry, one final observation that I wanted to make regarding the incredibly important point from Dr. Shida on the non-OECD countries. So, and here I would put China also, in a sense, to one side, because China is a very specific case. But if we look outside China at emerging and developing economies, of course, these are the countries that will see the largest growth in population, urbanization. They will be building up their national infrastructure. And so they need to be central to the conversation about changes in the energy system. And we do see a risk of new dividing lines coming in energy and climate in today's fractured geopolitical environment. It is very, very important in our view that we find ways to build new bridges with these countries and have a productive conversation and make sure that the investment is also following up on allowing the rising energy demand in these economies to be met in a sustainable way. That is a very, very strong focus for our work here at the International Energy Agency. So I hope I've covered some at least of the very interesting observations from our panel.
Thank you very much. Takamura-san's first question or Shida-san's question were addressed. And I believe pretty much the questions have been answered. But I'm trying to raise one point. The second question raised by Dr. Shida, nuclear SMR was referenced. For example, at IAEA, if you look at different models, and here we have experts, so I'd like to use jargon. It's innovation. Different types of SMRs are being developed. Generation 4, what will be equivalent to Generation 4 are being developed. So as Dr. Shida mentioned earlier, these are new. And so you have to think about safety. And by using high-speed neutrons, safeguards, that is safeguards against the military use. We have to think about safety from these two fronts. So on this point, innovation is happening throughout the world. I'd like to ask you on these points. What is your take on this, please?
So our view is that there are a number of attributes that small modular reactors have that could help them, in a sense, fit in with a changing energy system. But we also fully recognize the importance of the safety and security of these processes. But when we look at those attributes, obviously they have lower capital costs than the larger facilities. They have some inherent safety and waste management advantages relative to other designs. They have, to a degree, and we hope this is true, they've reduced project risks, and that can help to improve social acceptance and bring in also private investment for both the research and development phase, but also for larger scale deployment. One other area that we're very interested to look at is the possibility for SMRs to reuse the sites of retiring or retired fossil fuel power plants, so they could take advantage of the existing transmission infrastructure, the cooling water, the workforces, and that could help us ease the process of making that transformation in some cases. We think that there are possibilities also for co-locating some of these plants with industrial facilities to provide electricity, potentially to use the waste heat from the facilities, but also potentially to produce hydrogen. So I think there's a number of areas which we are very interested to see how this process plays out. We recognize that we're not there yet in terms of the policy and regulatory environment in many of these cases. So we're following very closely the debate in different countries of the world about how to bring some of these new technologies to market. And that means also things like adapting and streamlining licensing and regulatory frameworks to take these SMR attributes into account.
Thank you. So we'd like to have the Japanese side raise points. So from this point onward, we'd like to have the three Japanese participants talk, and then followed by Mr. Gould. Geopolitical risk has been covered to a considerable degree, so maybe we can focus more on decarbonization. As has been earlier mentioned, the Paris Agreement and the 1.5 degrees. Last month, the WMO, according to WMO 2023, that would be 1.5. It's 1.45 since before post-industrial. And by 2028, there may be 8% possibility that the degree would exceed 1.5 degrees. So when this happens, we have to be very effective in terms of decarbonization in the face of these temperature increases. And as you mentioned at the outset, at the Advisory Committee for Natural Resources and Energy, the 7th Energy Plan is being drawn up at the moment, and they're holding discussions toward this end. Takamura-san is a committee member, so I'd like to ask her to address decarbonization policies and other topics. Thank you very much. The geopolitical perspective, which was presented at the previous discussion, I believe what I have to say is largely related to this. Energy transition is such that looking at this from a geopolitical standpoint, they're interconnected, interlinked, and I think Mr. Gould pointed this out. The International Institute for Renewable Energy came up with a report, and as Mr. Gould mentioned, the energy transition, by going to decarbonization, the position of the Middle East and Russia would decline relatively. Europe and Japan, which is largely dependent on fossil fuels, may see a rise in position. From the standpoint of energy crisis, unfortunately, on a primary energy basis, it's a little over 10%. That's the self-sufficiency rate of Japan. If we look at the other G7 countries, Germany, I believe 2022 would be 35%, France 55%, the UK 76%, the United States 100%, exceeding 100%. So Japan's self-sufficiency rate is low. And if we look at the energy crisis, and the same applies to food as well, we are highly dependent on overseas sources, and the risk related to this is emerging. And so climate change countermeasures is in Japan tantamount to reducing energy demand, and from fossil fuels to try to make the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. That's about reducing energy dependency, and both are aligned. And so decarbonization, climate change countermeasures, in a certain sense, it's not just about for the world as a whole. It's something that would create great benefits for Japan, and I think this could be said. And the Agency for Natural Resources and Energy this year put forth from a macroeconomic standpoint, I believe this makes sense. In Japan, we export EVs and electronic equipment. In terms of trade balance, we're benefiting from this in Japan, and a lot of this is used to pay for fossil fuels. So we're moving our surpluses to the deficit in terms of our trade account. So decarbonization and climate change countermeasures are such that we're faced with an energy crisis, and there are challenges for the Japanese energy system, and these have become clearer. And to succeed in energy transition would be not only a stable supply of energy, but there'll be different benefits accruing from this, and that is what I think. I don't want to go into depth at this forum, but from the standpoint of businesses, decarbonized management would mean evaluation from the financial sector, and also it has benefits in terms of the supply chain. So at a reasonable price to obtain clean energy is a major challenge in Japan. So geopolitical and macroeconomic perspectives, not only that, it is also important in terms of business competitiveness, industrial competitiveness. in the face of energy crisis, it's about securing a supply of energy, but also toward energy transition or decarbonization or reducing dependence on imported fossil fuels. How do we move to make this happen? I believe that this is a major challenge for energy policies in Japan. It's a challenge, but at the same time, it's an opportunity. It could have a lot of positive effects on the Japanese economy. That is all. Thank you. She has discussed the macroeconomic standpoint as well. It was very interesting. So, Dr. Shida, could you also make an intervention? I'd like to add to what Professor Takamura has said. As Mr. Gould said, with decarbonization in the case of Japan, energy self-sufficiency rate would go up, and that is without a doubt. And in Mr. Tim Gould's slide, there was one on critical metals and the risks related to this. With decarbonization, the geopolitical risk is not reduced per se, but it changes its form. GTAP, it's a world database. It's a world trade model that is often used, and we did some analysis using this. The present industrial structure and trade structure, if we maintain this, and if a high-price carbon what is introduced, how would that affect the trade structure? Latin America and Africa trade balance would be positive, and other countries would see a negative. So those countries that have a lot of metal resources will have a positive effect, and I believe that was very interesting. And the other point, oil-producing countries, I believe Tanaka-san would mention this, something on this. It's not that oil-producing nations would see a decline in presence. Recently at the COP28, last year end, I participated in COP28, and in Dubai, it was took place in Dubai, and I talked to businesses there, and what was of interest to everyone was hydrogen. Oil-producing nations want to seize on greening, and they want to bring about structural changes. Hydrogen energy, if it's liquefied liquefied energy. And natural gas, they want to use the knowledge they have acquired, and in terms of know-how for contracting, and they want to build for themselves a new position using the technology they have acquired with greening and with hydrogen. It's in a not very simple form. The form of risk, I think, will change. That is what I think. And on the technological front, I'd like to make one comment. Japan going forward, in what way can Japan contribute? What would be important is energy saving, energy conservation. This is where we can play a part. And Mr. Gould's slide showed heat pumps. That's a very important technology. Japanese manufacturers have a technical edge related to this. And in broad terms, energy conservation is such that AI and data centers would be used. And so semiconductors, how to save energy on this front is an area where Japan's technology can serve the world. And on the macroeconomic front, these are merits which we can seize on. Thank you very much. In terms of decarbonization, we've had various points raised. Carbon was a very important in the past. Oil and gas were very useful, but because of different circumstances, these are no longer used. So decarbonization, the word decarbonization itself is such that when we think about why it's used so much, and this is my own personal view, diplomacy, and earlier China was mentioned, emerging countries were mentioned, diplomacy and international politics and business opportunities and innovation from this can develop. And so I believe that they could be served as a tool. And at OPEC, perhaps the angle is different. And this was mentioned earlier, OPEC and OPEC Plus, their dominance, and BRICS, and curbing their rapid growth. And there's also Russia. From the West, I think decarbonization can be used as a tool. So, Tanaka-san, could I ask you to comment on this?
Thank you very much. Very interesting point you raised. But before answering your question, as Professor Takamura said, decarbonization, that can be linked to the energy supply capability enhancement, but it will hit a ceiling at a certain point. As far as I can see, last year, the hydrogen basic plan was formulated, it was announced, and then 6 months before that, it's not energy, but national security-related 3 documents were announced by the government. National security documents were announced. So considering them, we can convert various things to hydrogen. It's an energy medium. So where do we purchase less expensively and securing a big quantity? We don't have a solution to this equation. As you mentioned in your question, in the Middle East, the hydrocarbon resource, natural gas, is reformed. And by the reform, they can obtain blue hydrogen. Is that what they want to have? Or they want to have CCUS to produce blue hydrogen? Then you realize that NNS, National Security Basic Plan, it's the same thing. What we write about energy is that we bring in energy from foreign countries. How do we secure sea lane for the transportation? That is the special field we focus on. So hydrogen plan is another thing. Partly it is combined, but in the final analysis, in what way hydrogen would be useful for the Japanese national security? From the perspective of national security, it's not well intertwined. U.S. has an energy plan, or U.S. NNS, National Security Strategy, and Europe, they have the similar thing. If you look at Europe and the United States, aside from the question of specificity in the new era, you want to raise your resilience in the new era energy. It is clearly mentioned. But in the case of national document, security documents in Japan, we don't say that. We don't incorporate it. We have the basic plan. It is just energy weapon is mentioned. Well, that is all right. Energy is categorized as weapon, and that is fine. But how do we bring in energy into our border? And from the point of view of security, how do we connect the energy security and national security? That is the weak point. We need to have a better coordination between the two. I was hoping that they would have announced in a better way. Now, answering your question, certainly new modality of energy, the decarbonization path is to be pursued. And then in the past, gas-producing countries and oil-producing countries, with these countries, we will develop a new kind of relationship, different from the past ways. CCUS is one field to consider, and blue hydrogen production technology, that can be the key to the collaboration for the Australia or Middle East countries or other gas-producing countries. We can use that as a new approach. It can be used as a diplomatic tool going forward, I suppose. And no doubt that will be contributing to Japanese national security. However, there is an issue. We predicate everything upon bringing bringing in something from foreign countries, then energy self-sufficiency rate will have a certain limit, even if you have the production of hydrogen on land. And then you will have to have the defense of a long sea lane, and it is a part of the package of the security of our country. So the littoral countries or related countries, FOIP is another concept. With the countries within the region, we should pursue the alignment and cooperation. In that way, we can enhance national security. I think that is the directionality.
Thank you very much. Hydrogen was mentioned here and there. In the second round, I hope to address this in more depth. So I'd like to put this question to Mr. Gould. A lot of talk, there was a lot of talk on supply chain, the Middle East and the Ukraine war and the impact of these were also mentioned. In the first half, 2024, the first half of 2024, what was of focus was maritime transportation. It's a strategic artery, Suez Canal, and also climate change and the impact of that, Panama Canal, and the reduction of water there, and Black Sea also is related to the North Sea, and through canals it cuts across Europe. So these are very important sea areas. There's stagnation in all of these areas, and it's impacting maritime transportation. The Cape of Good Hope route is now being used. So before the end of the year, in the latter half of 2024, in terms of cargo volume, I believe this would impact the cost and bring about rise in prices. Among geopolitical risks, maritime transportation that accounts for 80% of 90% of cargo transportation. So for Japan, I believe because we import energy, this is a very important aspect. So could we ask you to address this topic, please?
Thank you very much indeed. And I'd also like to just thank Professor Tanaka, Professor Takamura, and Dr. Shida for these very good observations, which highlight once again, the evolving nature of energy security and the need for us to be constantly vigilant, not just for traditional risks, although they remain, but also for some of the new and evolving ways in which both developments in energy markets, but also, as you point out, developments in geopolitics and in weather can affect our energy security. And I think, we spend a lot of time looking, of course, at developments in the Middle East, the risks to shipping in the Red Sea, the potential risks of any widening of the conflict could pose for energy security. And indeed, one of the observations that we have at the moment is that because of the rerouting of different cargoes, we have more oil in transportation than we would do normally. That affects market balances in interesting ways. And alongside all of the elements that Professor Tanaka mentioned in his opening remarks about the reorientation of trade flows as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions that were put on Russia. The interesting thing from our perspective is that this reorientation and the current disruption to some shipping flows, it has not had a very large implication yet for prices. And I think that speaks to many things, but I think it speaks in particular to the fact that we do have quite a strong buffer of spare production capacity in the world at the moment. Even if you exclude the sanctioned Russian and Iranian barrels, we are still somewhere between 5 and 6 million barrels a day of global oil production capacity, in a sense, in reserve. And that gives us, in a sense, a little bit of flexibility to absorb the sort of shocks that we have seen. I think two things when we look out to the future. Indeed, as a number of panelists have already pointed out, for many countries, energy transitions also mean a reduced reliance on imported fuels. And that will affect not just their balance of payments and energy security, but it would also affect our reliance on some of these major shipping routes around the world. But that is not going to affect all countries equally at the same time, because what we observe is that we have a shift from trade in the Atlantic basin towards sort of the countries of developing Asia who will continue to rely on imported resources, including fossil fuels. And so I think what we need to do, as always, is look very closely at the mechanisms that we have to manage the potential for disruptions in oil supply. As many of you know, at the IEA, we manage the coordinated stockholding requirements of IEA member countries. I think it is very important for us to have in mind that as we move through transitions, the efficacy of that system will also change. And so we need to think carefully about how to engage other new importing countries or major importing countries that are not currently members of the IEA in those systems of collective security. And to come back to an issue that was mentioned already, in that it's very important to have in mind the importance of India and India's application to join the International Energy Agency. When you think about our ability to respond in the future to some of these more traditional risks to energy security, but also the emerging risks that we may see as we move through transition.
Thank you very much. And hydrogen, as Tanaka-san has mentioned, hydrogen has to be created from raw material. And so that's a checkpoint. Methane, there's a lot of expectations on methane. Its positive aspects. According to METI in Japan, there may be risks associated with this as well. And that's was very interesting to hear. And so I'd like to ask Mr. Gould at this point, and since we're experts here in the hall, I would like to put this very succinctly. There are different colors of hydrogen. There's blue hydrogen and green hydrogen or pink. So there are these different kinds of hydrogen. And Japan is talking about gray. That is a reform methane. If we do that, that produces CO2. Can we deal with this through CCUS? In Europe, at IEA, in these places, what is the hydrogen that they have high expectations of? What kind of hydrogen do they have high expectations of? According to U.S. magazine Science, 2023 breakthrough. In this, it was not number one, but white hydrogen was included. And natural hydrogen in gas fields. It's distributed. And Science, a famous magazine, listed this among breakthroughs. So it's not a dubious idea. In Europe and in the United States, there seems to be a lot of interest in this. If this is commercialized, it will replace primary energy. Using methane or using oil, it will be the same thing. We don't do this at all here in Japan. So none of the Japanese newspapers have taken it up. Even the national newspaper. There may be differences in gaps. But what color hydrogen is Europe focusing on? And white hydrogen, which we know nothing of at the moment. Could I have your views on this, please? Please.
So when we look at different sources of hydrogen, and particularly in Europe, the preference in regulation is also for electrolytic hydrogen, so hydrogen produced from renewable electricity. However, the perspective of the International Energy Agency is that we should not be focusing on the color. We should be focusing on the cost and on the environmental attributes of that process. And we had some very important encouragement from Japan during the G7 presidency, asking us to think about ways of classifying hydrogen that are based on those environmental characteristics. So what are the emissions associated with those sources of hydrogen? And can we then have a different way of thinking about hydrogen production that is a bit more, in a sense, technically rational and not sort of color-coded as such? So we don't know yet which route for hydrogen will be the most cost-effective. I think it will be very different in different parts of the world, depending on the endowment of renewables, but also on the potential to use nuclear and the costs of natural gas production. So you will have competing sources of hydrogen in different parts of the world. I think what's also very important to have in mind is 2 points. One is that hydrogen itself will not be the source of large revenue streams for exporting countries that will, in any sense, match those that are currently gained from oil and gas. There is no resource rent to speak of that will be gained from hydrogen producers. The big prize for the Middle East is not to gain from exporting hydrogen as such, but it is to use that hydrogen as the basis for its own industrial growth and the potential then to produce low emissions goods at home, using the advantages that it has both for producing low emissions gases and fuels, but also for renewable electricity. And the second point that I'd like to make in our own analysis, it comes through very clearly, is that there are many countries around the world that are seeking to become producers. There are many fewer that see big domestic uses for hydrogen. So we have a sort of imbalance in the planning for hydrogen economy. Lots of people looking to become suppliers, a much smaller group committing to using that low emissions hydrogen. And the outcome is that only a very small proportion of those supply projects that have been developed are in a position where they are taking final investment decisions. So less than 5% of the supply projects out there are moving ahead towards a real producing project. So we focus very much in our discussions with governments on how can they incentivize also the big demand centers to move and commit to greater use of hydrogen. That for us is the missing link in the development of this potentially important new energy source.
Thank you. That's a very interesting entry point. It's very interesting indeed. He was talking about the white hydrogen toward the end, about becoming a supplying nation. Since Dr. Komiyama is here, I've been trying to use some technical scientific words to impress him, but we had some points raised by the audience. White hydrogen or natural hydrogen. You don't feel that the prospects are very good for this? So how do you evaluate white hydrogen? In Mali, a large gas field has been discovered, and it seems that the cost can be quite cheap. What is your evaluation of white hydrogen? Dr. Gould, please.
For me, yes. Well, we're following those discussions very closely. For the moment, it is another potential source. We would like to look very closely at also the environmental performance of those production facilities to see, whether they are competitive also in terms of cost and emissions with other hydrogen routes. But clearly, the process of producing hydrogen whether it's steam reforming of methane or whether it is the electrolysis of water, that is quite energy and capital intensive. So if you are extracting hydrogen directly from the ground, there are potential advantages there. But we have to see, it's still quite early days for assessing the economics of that route for hydrogen production. And of course, in the end, hydrogen is, the production costs are one thing, but bringing that hydrogen to the place where it can be used is quite an expensive process. So we would need to look carefully also at location to see, what is the potential to bring that hydrogen into the market.
Thank you. Dr. Shida, can you talk about hydrogen? There are several points we'd like to ask about. In Japan, reforming, and there are different methods. Could you talk about the recent trends or your views? Understood. In the flow of discussions at the moment, there was mention of the fact that you should not hydrogen in terms of color, but you have to think in terms of cost and the environmental aspects. And from the producer side, that is a point to be made. In hydrogen, you have to develop different ways of use. And I believe that is one thing we have to do. If we compare hydrogen to other decarbonization technologies, it's competitive in certain respects, and it's complementary in some respects in terms of power generation. Renewable energy is very variable in terms of geographical, but if as hydrogen can play a complementary role here, and both has to be introduced within the energy system. And the other is in the transportation sector, EV, electric vehicles. This is very much a subject of focus. Let's talk about the critical metals. If all cars become EVs, will there be enough supply of these critical metals? So depending on the use of vehicles, not only batteries, but carbon neutral fuels perhaps can be used. Hydrogen-based synthetic fuels can be used. There are possibilities for use of other types of fuels, which we have to think about doing. Of course, how to manufacture is one thing, but on the we have to look at the demand side. How to create the demand and how to deal with demand is something that we have to think about. Thank you. Time has passed very quickly as we discuss different things. So we're deviating from the process we discussed earlier. Takamura-san, could you make a sort of interim closing remark? Sort of summarize the discussion so far and then go into Q&A. And I asked you for a wrap-up, maybe a little over 2 minutes. I'm a bit perplexed by being put on the spot. It's not a summary, but I'd like to make 2 points in relation to the discussion that has taken place. Professor Tanaka talked about hydrogen. When we think about the importance of national energy, national security and implications regarding this is very large. And when you think about this, energy transition, decarbonization, moving towards decarbonization, moving forward with the energy transition, if we move forward with that, of course, the implications on national security and geopolitical aspects have to be considered. International relations, these will all change, I believe. the trading partners for energy will probably change, and I believe this is the case true in Australia. They're changing from export of coal to decarbonized low-C energy sources. So the partners themselves are changing trade and energy policies. So in this situation, as Professor Tanaka mentioned, we have to take a renewed look at this issue in terms of security. That is diplomatic policies in terms of foreign policy. What does this imply? This is something we have to think about. And secondly, when we think about energy transition, the timeline is very important. In the ultimate end, what kind of energy system do we want to have, and what is the energy mix that we want? There are different pathways to this, but in the short run, the present energy self-sufficiency rate, and I don't believe that the present self-sufficiency rate is acceptable, and the present supply is acceptable. Even if we think only in terms of energy self-sufficiency, the present is not sufficient. So, domestically produced energy. You might ask, what is the definition of domestic energy? But to internalize the production of energy, we have to expand that and promote that. That is one challenge that we have, I think. Of course, energy itself to be produced domestically, as Dr. Shida mentioned at the outset, the facilities equipment for supplying energy to internalize this internalize supply chains or critical minerals. These have to be borne in mind in formulating energy policy. I think that is what must be done. And most probably in the short run, diversifying procurement is one measure that we can take. At the same time, I believe that Japan is making a lot of effort in terms of leveraging domestic resources to produce energy. Next generation solar power generation and the development thereof is a case in point. And Dr. Shida mentioned this earlier. Presently, energy policies are such that, as Mr. Tanaka said, it's a security issue. But energy policies as an industrial policy is becoming very important, creating employment, creating new industries, and economic security, and important resources. From that perspective, energy policies are not confined to just energy policies per se. And we're facing the energy crisis, so we have to bear in mind that energy policies are much broader than previously contemplated. That is all. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I have taken you by surprise. But you were, in a certain way, prepared for this. And so we'd like to entertain questions from the audience. Tanaka-san, you had your hand raised first. Thank you.
Tim, very good to see you. This is Nobuo Tanaka. To
comment on what Professor Takamura said and to what Mr. Tanaka has said, it's an issue of energy security, and I agree with this. To add, nuclear security is something that we definitely have to think about. Otherwise, we will not come up with an answer with regard to nuclear. Some serious thought is warranted. And to using small-sized reactors, nuclear submarines, should we have that? Of course, we will not have nuclear bombs, but these two issues have to be discussed in connection with nuclear. Otherwise, we will not have an answer for the future of nuclear. From the standpoint of security, we have to have this discussion.
Next question to Tim. Takamura Sensei asked you the question, what will be the primary demand, global primary demand of energy in the future? I know that you answered the demand for electricity. So definitely data center AI may increase or may not, as Bill Gates is saying. So we don't know yet. But even though the electricity demand increases, there are some arguments that by reducing the fossil fuel use for heat or internal combustion engine means that loss of energy will decline substantially. So the total global primary demand of energy may not increase. What is the view of the IEA?
Then, in order, could we have Takamura-san answer first? The first question goes to Takamura, Professor Takamura. I had a comment from Mr. Tanaka in terms of security. When we think about nuclear, we have to think about this in terms of national security, and I think that was the point made. And what he said is exactly true. And as Dr. Shida pointed out, nuclear proliferation proliferation. And on this issue, we have to also think about this. And that was a point made by Dr. Shida. So there's lots of things that we have to think about. And I believe a point has been made which was not discussed so far. Could we go to you, Tanaka-san?
Of course, what he said was convincing, but considering the utilization by SDF, it is almost meaningful. Submarine is not something that SDF requires. It is so noisy, it is meaningless. The meaningfulness is a second strike capability. That is for a submarine. The ballistic missile is launched from a submarine. That is the meaning of having submarines. But as of now, the Japanese nuclear policy, we are not weaponizing that. And if it is not realistic to consider the nuclear-powered submarines. Now, Mr. Gould, could you respond to your question?
Well, first of all, it's very nice to see our former executive director, Mr. Tanaka, and greetings to you, sir. And thank you very much for the question. And indeed, you capture something that is very important to understand about the nature of the change that we are beginning, because we consume today enough energy for a much bigger economy, global economy, because there is a lot of waste within our current system. As was rightly mentioned, a lot of the fossil fuels that are used, for example, in power generation, a lot of that energy is just wasted as it just emerges as heat that is not used productively. There is also waste in many of the processes that we have. Despite the very good example of Japan for energy efficiency, there is a huge scope for improvements in efficiency in many of the technologies that we use worldwide. And so when we think about energy transitions, and as we move towards a more electrified system, we get some quite strong inherent efficiency gains from moving from fuel combustion to other ways of producing energy. And that means that in a rapid energy transition, the total primary energy supply hardly increases. In fact, you could argue that there is a very respectable outlook for the global energy system where total primary energy supply remains essentially flat. And so I think that's a very important insight. It does not mean that we have to do without important energy services. It just means that these are met in different ways, in ways that are more efficient. An electric motor is inherently more efficient than an internal combustion engine. A heat pump is inherently more efficient than a fueled boiler for producing hot water. So I think those sorts of things should be integrated into the way that we think about energy transitions.
Thank you. Indeed, this is a very important issue. And there's some sense of anxiety as to whether we can allow this to expand. Thank you very much for a very appropriate comment. Any other questions from the floor in this room? Yes, over there, please. Thank you very much for a very outstanding discussion. It was very thought-provoking, and I learned a great deal. What Mr. Tanaka has mentioned, basics of energy supply were addressed, and decarbonization is what I'd like to talk about. In terms of energy efficiency, I believe this is a question regarding what we should do. I listened to talk about hydrogen energy security, and when I think about this, 20 years from now, if just before we achieve net zero, 2045 or so, 2044, 25, if we jump to that year, in the context of energy crisis, most probably decarbonized energy crisis, I think this will emerge, and I can surmise that this will happen. And when I think about this, Japan in procuring decarbonized energy, just before achieving net zero, renewable energy procurement from overseas. What do we think about this? I think this will come up for discussion specifically. As was mentioned at this discussion, gray hydrogen or blue hydrogen with CCUS or CCS. I believe the cost benefit is most. I believe the cost benefit is not so high. Creating green hydrogen from renewable energy will become cheaper, and if we liaise with different countries in terms of energy procurement, I think this is a very important thing we should do. With regard to transport of hydrogen, that's expensive. And what Japan is interested now is synfuels. And renewable energy, to create something where renewable energy is cheap. And by Japan procuring this, Japan's energy net zero can be achieved. I believe that that might be the world view that we would come to, and I can foresee that. And there are fossil fuel producing resource countries, and then there are countries which have a high potential in terms of renewable energy. If we include all of this in terms of energy procurement strategy, is there a climate for this at the moment to consider energy policies bearing all of these countries in mind? So 20 years from now, if we warp to 20 years from now, decarbonized energy crisis, what will be some of the risks which will remain, and what are the potential means of overcoming these risks? These are my questions. Who is this question addressed to? Primarily Mr. Gould. And if others, panelists, have comments, I would welcome that too. It will depend on how much time we have left. Mr. Gould, 20 years from now, and the decarbonization landscape there. Could you talk about the decarbonization landscape 20 years from now, please?
So I'll just mention a few of the risks that we will need to pay attention to in 20 years' time, assuming that we are in a rapid energy transition. There will still be some of the more traditional risks that we see today, because even in such a scenario, there will be countries and there will be sectors that will still be using fossil fuels. But in terms of the new elements that we need to be prepared for. A lot of it is around the way that we manage a more electrified and renewable rich system. So we need to be paying a great deal of attention to issues around cybersecurity. We will need to be paying a whole lot of attention to the resilience of our energy system to weather events, because we will still see an increased incidence of weather-related risks to the operation of our energy system, and we will be more dependent than before on a single source of energy in the form of electricity. So that combination there means that we need to be very vigilant on those areas. And then I feel that, all of the issues that we've discussed around clean energy manufacturing, reliance on imports of technology, will become, and also of critical minerals, that will become, I think, a very critical part of the way that transitions are managed, and the risks that are perceived. So I think, a focus on those areas will be extremely important as well.
Thank you for that. I believe it's a very good timing to finish, but we still have 3 minutes. But let me say that time is up. We could go on forever. There's a lot of interest. I think there was a groundswell of interest, but I'd like to bring this discussion to a close at this point. First of all, to the panelists, including Mr. Gould, thanks, and to the audience, we'd like to express our gratitude as well. We have a big round of applause for the panelists. Thank you very much. With regard to this discussion, you will find this in the morning edition of Yomiuri Shimun, and on the 11th, Thursday, there'll be a feature on this discussion as well. Please have a look. With this, I'd like to conclude the discussion. Thank you very much. Please do not leave anything behind. Thank you. And please do not forget to return your receivers. Have a safe journey home, and thank you very much once again.